Hello guys, welcome to another episode of Feel the Pedal podcast. I am Gabriel Martins and I still remain as the host of this podcast. This is episode number 7 of the podcast, and you might have already guessed from the episode title that today you're on to something different. Today is the first solo episode, and believe me, it's not for lacking in guests. I can tell you right away that we have guests confirmed for the next 3 episodes. The next one will be a double guest episode with, spoiler alert, 2 giants on protein metabolism, one from Canada and the other one from Portugal. Yes, the first guest from my home country on this show will be on the next episode. But before getting into today's episode, let's quickly get into the latest in cycling racing. The Giro d'Italia has started and Primož Roglič entered as one of the favorites for this year's Giro d'Italia, undefeated in his 3 races in 2019, the UAE Tour, Tirreno Adriatico, and the Tour of Romandie, and he wasted no time in taking charge of the pink leader's jersey by winning the time trial on the first day. He would then lose the pink jersey on stage 6 to Valerio Conti from UAE Team Emirates, but he has no quit in him, and he just blew away everyone watching stage 9 by winning the time trial again, even beating the 1-hour record holder Victor Campenaerts, getting much closer again to getting that Maglia Rosa back. And allow me for a bit of patriotism in showing my joy for the Portuguese rider Amaro Antunes from CCC in taking the 7th place in the overall standings in this Giro d'Italia. His first Grand Tour from the rider from the Algarve region, from my home region as well, so best of luck for my neighbor Amaro Antunes, força nas canetas Amaro. And since we're talking about young riders and Algarve, how about mentioning Tadej Pogačar? Please try to pronounce the names of the riders correctly. I don't speak Slovenian for sure, but YouTube and Google Translator can make miracles. Tadej Pogačar, who won this year's Volta ao Algarve, has just won the Tour of California, becoming the youngest rider to ever win a World Tour stage race, as he defended the yellow jersey on the 7th and final day of the Tour of California. The 20-year-old Slovenian finished safely in the peloton as Cesc Bol from Team Sunweb was the fastest in the bunch sprint in Pasadena. Peter Sagan from Bora Hansgrohe and Jasper Philipsen from UAE Team Emirates finished 2nd and 3rd respectively. On the women's side, Elisa Balsamo from Valcar Cycling sprinted to victory on the 3rd and final stage of the Tour of California women's race, which was won overall by world race champion Anna van der Breggen, ahead of her Boels Dolzman teammate and 2018 race winner Katie Hall, with CCC Liv's Ashley Moolman-Pasio in 3rd place. As for the Giro d'Italia, let's see what happens until the 2nd of June now that the mountain stages are coming. So, for today's menu, I intend to talk to you a bit about carbohydrate mouth rinse application in cycling and what is my personal view from the research we've performed on our research group here at University Camilo José Cela in Madrid with Dr. Juan del Coso. But just a brief note before we start digging into the subject. I am not by any means an expert on this matter. There are many researchers in the world who have been repeatedly and consistently researching on this topic since 2004, the year of the first research paper on the subject by Dr. James Cotter and Dr. Asker Jukendrup. The reason I feel that I can provide some information is not only because we've just recently published a paper on the subject. The title of our study is Carbohydrate Mouth Rinse Decreases Time to Complete a Simulated Cycling Time Trial. And as in any research paper, we had to go through all the research so far on the subject. Nothing new until now, of course. This is one of the basic steps in any research paper to provide a proper context for the study and then discuss it. But one of the main reasons was actually due to the interesting comments and insights by one of the reviewers that were actually quite relevant and eye-opening for me as for the real practicality to take into account when considering to rinse carbohydrate in the mouth in the specific context of cycling. I thought this could provide some good foundation for an episode here on Feel the Pedal, and I'll try my best to share with you my views on this subject, even though I'm no expert. So, how did carbohydrate mouth rinse studies begin in the first place? Back in 2004, Dr. James Carter and his colleagues from the University of Birmingham infused either glucose, 1 gram per minute, or saline as a placebo in 6 endurance-trained cyclists and instructed them to complete a set amount of work in a cycle ergometer as quickly as possible. In this study, what they found was that the infusion of glucose did not produce any ergogenic effect over saline infusion, despite the infusion of glucose increased availability of plasma glucose and increased glucose uptake. So, what's wrong here? Infusing glucose directly has no effects on exercise performance, but ingesting carbohydrate does? So, back in 2004, the positive role of carbohydrate ingestion was already quite well established. So the authors questioned themselves if ingesting this amount of carbohydrate has a direct impact on exercise performance, why is it that the direct infusion produces no effect whatsoever on performance? The infusion, in theory, would deliver glucose to its final destination, sort of saying. There must be some part in the carbohydrate ingestion process that may be responsible for such effect. Let's start, for example, with the first part of ingestion, which is the sensing of carbohydrate in the mouth by simply rinsing a maltodextrin solution in the oral cavity without swallowing to see what happens. Of course, I don't know if this was the exact way of thinking by the authors, but they did move on to perform a second study, and this one would be the very first study on carbohydrate mouth rinse. So they had 7 male and 2 female endurance cyclists to regularly rinse in the mouth a non-sweet maltodextrin solution and water as a placebo. And surprisingly, rinsing with the maltodextrin solution significantly reduced the time to complete the performance trial. This led Carter and colleagues to draw 2 conclusions from their observations. The first was that there are taste receptors in the mouth that can influence neural pathways, ultimately leading to improved exercise performance. And the second, that there are receptors in the mouth sensitive to non-sweet carbohydrate. Posterior studies confirmed that these oral receptors could directly stimulate reward centers in the brain, leading to a positive central drive that would ultimately improve endurance exercise performance, even in situations in which muscle and hepatic glycogen stores are not depleted. But what exactly is carbohydrate mouth rinse? So, this can be defined as flushing a carbohydrate-based drink around the oral cavity for a certain time. Studies so far have tested this from 5 up to 15 seconds, followed by the subsequent expulsion of the fluid. It's not supposed to be swallowed, of course, that would be cheating, but it is the sensing of carbohydrates in the mouth that seems to be able to activate some areas of the brain and induce this positive effect, or at least minimize the negative signals from fatigue that may appear during prolonged or intense exercise. And the question that is often asked is, why rinsing and not swallowing it straight away? It may seem like an obvious question, but it is a good one to be asked, and hopefully you can understand why I say this by the end of the episode. We'll get to that later on. So, plenty of research associates carbohydrate mouth rinse to positive effects in athletic performance, not only in endurance activities, but also with a growing interest in high-intensity sprint-based activities. However, there are some particularities that need to be taken into account and need some explanation. Particularities such as rinsing frequency, how many times do we need to do it during a trial, type of carbohydrate used to rinse, the carbohydrate concentration in said drink, the duration of the rinse in the mouth, the duration of the trials performed so far, and one that I think may be the most conditioning variable, if subjects were in a fed or in a fasted state. As for the type of carbohydrate used so far, all the carbohydrates that have been tested in trials have demonstrated positive results. These include glucose, maltodextrin, and sucrose, as demonstrated by the seminal study by Dr. James Carter and colleagues, along with many other posterior studies. The sweetness of the carbohydrate doesn't seem to matter. Studies that used maltodextrin with little or no taste have shown the same level of brain activation as other carbohydrates such as glucose, and the performance effects have not been different with different carbohydrates as long as they are not artificial sweeteners, and this is one of the most curious facts about carbohydrate mouth rinse. Although they do taste quite sweet, they don't seem to promote beneficial effects on performance, and the same brain areas that are activated when rinsing with carbohydrate do not appear to be activated when rinsing with artificial sweeteners. It would seem that our taste buds can actually tell the difference between real or fake carbohydrate, sort of saying. This is why in our trial we have used a commercial bottled fruit juice containing a mix of different types of carbohydrate, in this case sucrose, glucose and fructose, while the placebo beverage was an identical in appearance and taste, but contained artificial sweeteners, in this case sucralose and acesulfame potassium or acesulfame K. As for the rinsing frequency, and this is an important detail to take into account as well, when we normally hear all the fuss around carbohydrate mouth rinse and some coaches recommending it, they simply say, just rinse every now and then and it seems to do something. But things don't actually work like that, and we have to see how the studies are performed and then try to reproduce the same methodology. And the methodology that is often used since the first trial by Dr. James Carter is to rinse every 12.5% of the total duration or distance of the trial. In a 60-minute trial, this would correspond to rinsing carbohydrate each 7.5 minutes, for example. Other authors have used other methodologies of rinsing each 5 minutes. So it's not just a matter of reading somewhere that this works. Things need to be reproduced properly. And in order for carbohydrate mouth rinse to be properly reproduced, it needs to be rinsed in regular periods of each 5 to 10 minutes probably, which you may be already thinking that this may not be practical in some contexts. And this takes us to the next important point to take into account, which is the duration of the rinse in the mouth. And this is a big one. Only after 9 years after the first carbohydrate mouth rinse study, Gam and colleagues proposed in 2013 something to take into account in the carbohydrate mouth rinse studies, and it was the fact that when we are rinsing any liquid in the mouth for a particular amount of time, especially when performing exercise at high intensities, we are restricting our breathing patterns, making us breathe through the nose only, which may actually be detrimental to exercise performance. He also suggested that future investigations included a no-rinse control group to isolate this effect. Now imagine being on a race with your heart rate at 180 BPM and having to rinse a carbohydrate drink in the mouth each 5 to 10 minutes, having to maintain the drink in your mouth for 5 to 10 seconds, and therefore limiting the amount of oxygen you can get into your lungs. This was actually one of the things we've tried to take into account in our trial, and that's why we've tested this during the pilot study, in which we asked the subjects if the 10-second rinse restricted too much their breathing compared to the 5-second rinse, and 75% of them reported that the 5-second rinse was much more reasonable, and so we decided to follow through with this 5-second protocol. There was already some evidence supporting a positive effect of the 5-second rinse. As for the drink concentration in carbohydrate, there's no secret here. Almost all concentrations ranging from 6% up to 17% concentration of carbohydrate seem to be able to work or produce some effect, which is a range of most commercial fruit juices, sodas, and even sports drinks. I would just say that using a sports drink or an isotonic drink to spit it out may be a waste of money when you can use a regular commercial fruit juice, or the cheapest option of all, adding some good old table sugar to water, since sucrose seems to work as well as other carbohydrate sources. I would say 2.5 tablespoons per 500 milliliters in your bottle would be required. The electrolytes containing in the isotonic drink do not seem to provide any further benefit to the effect of rinsing carbohydrates in the mouth, so save your isotonic drinks for when you actually need to swallow the drink. So now let's get into one of the most important details to take into account, which is, does this work better when exercising in a fed versus fasted state? And the answer is that carbohydrate mouth rinse has repeatedly been shown to elicit higher power output and faster trial times when performed in a fasted state, with 3 exceptions that have shown no benefit on improving neither performance output nor decreasing time trial. This has been seen mostly in events lasting between 30 to 75 minutes, and though only examined on a few occasions, carbohydrate carbohydrate mouth rinse does not typically benefit high-intensity sprint performance. The only exceptions happen in trials using repeated sprints were performed in a glycogen-depleted state, which appears to indicate that high-intensity performance may be improved when carbohydrate mouth rinse is delivered under conditions of fatigue or metabolic strain. Although some evidence suggests that carbohydrate mouth rinse may be useful prior to the closing kilometers of a competitive event, such as in the study performed by Dr. Nicholas Ludden from James Madison University, Harrisonburg, who performed a 2-hour constant load protocol plus a 30-kilometer time trial that took a little bit less than 1 hour for the subjects to finish. Only after this, he had participants perform 3 5-second carbohydrate mouth rinse in a 15-minute transitioning for a 2-kilometer time trial. The authors found a likely enhanced performance effect in this 2-kilometer time trial with this approach. But, as the authors clearly state, and I quote, "The practical relevance of this finding should be further established, as the mouth rinse solution was administered after approximately 3 hours of cycling without carbohydrate supplementation." This may indicate that we don't know yet if this kind of approach will work in a real racing-like scenario, when cyclists are always, I would say, in a fat state. So, the same way that carbohydrate mouth rinse has a lesser effect when trials are commenced in the fat state, probably the same could happen when considering rinsing carbohydrate in the fat state after 3 hours of exercise. But this is just speculation from my part, of course. This still requires further research. So now let's try and put everything together so far. So this strategy appears to work if we rinse any form of carbohydrate in the mouth in frequent intervals that can go from 5 to 10 minutes, surely not rinsing once or twice. The rinsing duration should be at least 5 seconds, but they can reach 10 seconds. This drink needs to have at least 6% carbohydrate concentration, and more concentrations appear to have no extra effect. The effects are more relevant in trials from 30 to 75 minutes, especially when performed in a fasted state. So now that we know the conditions in which carbohydrate mouth rinse may produce benefits, let's think of the context in which this can be applied. What sort of competition can last between 30 to 75 minutes? Everyone who knows about cycling may already know the answer. Time trials. We have an example of stage 9 of the Giro d'Italia where Primož Roglič blew away rivals with a time of 51 minutes and 52 seconds, a result that clearly fits within this range. But in our study, we had subjects perform a simulated time trial in a fat state, and we saw a reduction in time to complete the trial and an increase in power output. But should we therefore automatically state that this strategy can apply to cycling time trials? The most important thing in cycling time trials is probably aerodynamics, and in order to maintain an aero position, the cyclist cannot break position in order to reach for the drink once every 5 or 7 minutes. We don't even see cyclists drinking or eating during that period, and teams often choose not to carry bottles on the rider's bike during such an event. So it may not be applicable, and I believe that we don't have enough evidence to sustain the idea that rinsing near the end of the race may promote some benefit, especially because the subjects are in a fat state, and in that occasion, why not just swallowing the drink? This could be interesting, however, if a rider is having some sort of negative gastrointestinal symptoms during a race and they can't ingest anything. Rinsing would at least not make the symptoms worse. Still, I believe this is very unpractical in a moment of such tension as the last 2 kilometers of the race, where riders are just so much focused on positioning themselves for the sprint ahead, and even if it's a summit finish, I just don't see it, and I think the benefit would be minimal to even consider it at that particular moment. In mountain bike or even in cyclocross races, I believe this could be even worse given the greater technical skill required to maintain balance, avoid obstacles constantly, and produce constant peaks of power output during the race. So why not swallowing it indeed? At least during race-like events in almost every cycle sport, swallowing appears to be the best option. But again, I'm no expert in this matter, and this is simply my interpretation of the data so far. What I do believe is that a promising strategy in the lab means nothing if it cannot be applied in a real-life scenario. But does this mean that carbohydrate mouth rinse has absolutely no place in cycling? I wouldn't say so, and that's exactly what we've tried to highlight in our paper. Since race-like events may not allow for such strategy to be performed for the reasons I've just mentioned, there may be an application in a training context, particularly when intentionally training in a fasted state or in the typical sleep low, train low model as part of a training low strategy, as we have previously discussed with our guest, Dr. Sam Impey. This may just provide the closest condition in which carbohydrate mouth rinse may actually work. Being in a fasted state, ability to be able to rinse frequently with rest intervals that allow for the rinsing duration not to condition your performance, as well as it would happen in a race-like environment. So in this context, carbohydrate mouth rinse can be performed, and it could help perhaps in maintaining or increasing power output during a workout in which we don't want carbohydrate to be ingested. So just to conclude here, guys, carbohydrate mouth rinse can be an effective strategy for minimizing a possible performance decrement that can happen when training in a glycogen depleted or in a fasted state, or even while aiming to generate an energy deficit for that rider. During such sessions, carbohydrate mouth rinse may actually allow for a better maintenance of exercise intensity despite reduced carbohydrate availability. We could eventually consider other complementary strategies to minimize these effects of training in a fasted state, such as providing a low dose of caffeine along with the carbohydrate mouth rinse protocol. And this is what my interpretation of the data is. Guys, I truly hope I was able to deliver you with more answers than questions. I really want you to realize how important it is to properly contextualize certain strategies. This requires reading the papers in full, of course, understanding the different conditions they have been performed in, and figuring out if the conditions of our sport in terms of logistics, practicality, allow for that protocol to be implemented, especially considering if there aren't any other priorities to take into account rather than that new strategy may suggest. So that was it for today's shorter than usual episode. I can express how much I am looking forward for the next couple of episodes. The next one, as I have previously mentioned, is a double guest episode, and we'll be discussing... No, I'm not gonna tell you. I would spoil the surprise, but believe me, it's a topic everyone loves and needs to be clarified ASAP. We may be putting a nail in the coffin in one or two topics there. Thank you so much for listening. Fuel the Pedal is on every social media platform if you want to stay updated for some announcements, and the podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many other podcast apps that you may have access to. This was Fuel the Pedal podcast. I am your host, Gabriel Martins. Stay tuned, boys and girls.